Glad to have you joining us for another episode of Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
Coming to you today from Nashville in a convention center room with a lovely background. For those of you listening and not watching, imagine a very wild geometric pattern as we're talking, and that will be pretty accurate.
And no matter where you are in Nashville, you can hear just some country music riffs in the background.
That's right. We're here for a conference, which will get kicked off later this day. But for right now, we wanted to take some time to focus on some curiosity, not judgment. And today, really talking about how do we derive a sense of peace, or how do we navigate chaos?
We all have situations in our lives that seem chaotic. And, you know, I find chaos very uncomfortable.
Oh, for sure.
And especially if there's no resolution. You know, I like to fix things. And so if I find myself in a chaotic situation and I just don't see any way out, very few things frustrate me more.
Maybe this backdrop is very appropriate for today's topic because it's very chaos in my brain. And, you know, I think you're exactly right. We, in our natural state, we want to be at that place of rest when there's all this discombobulation, when there's all of these things that are crowding for our attention, when they are jumping in and demanding that we deal with the chaos of the moment. We can't get to that place of equilibrium and that place of peace. And we desperately want to be there. I think that's a human condition, that we want to be at that place of peace and equilibrium. But the questions are, how do we take steps, I guess, towards that when we may or may not be able to do anything about the chaotic circumstances around us?
So let's think about that for a second. You know me, I'm an engineer. I like to break things down. So there's things we can do ourselves, which is really the only thing we can control. Mm-hmm. There's things that we can do in certain circumstances, and sometimes thinking about those ahead of time is better than trying to react in the middle of them.
Sure.
And then there's questions we can ask that might have, would hope to have a positive effect with the people, right? So ourselves, circumstances, and people could be a way to kind of break this down as we discuss this as to what techniques or what things we might think of to try to bring order from chaos.
Well, so I think we have to start with ourselves, because my guess is that there's very little we can do about the people or the circumstances. Maybe there's some things we can do to help alleviate some pressure there, but starting with ourselves, I think, is the natural first step.
Yeah, we can't control others and we can't control our circumstances. We can try, but that leads to even more stress and more chaos in general. So starting with ourselves, let's think about, what it is. I can tell you, for me personally, the more I can let go of my own agenda, the more I can let go of my own prescribed outcomes in a given situation, the more peace and calm I have. If I can look at things objectively, and this is a big if, and say, okay, even if I'm passionate about this subject, I'm open to other folks' ideas, I'm open to other solutions, and I'm open to, I'm naturally going to where people are involved, but even in circumstances, I'm open that the world is going to go in a certain direction, and my agenda outcome may not be one of the solution sets.
I mentioned we were in Nashville, and I got a chance to do a little bit of playing tourist yesterday and did the hop-on, hop-off bus. And one of the buildings that we drove by, the bus driver pointed out, he said, "You see this dirty line on this building?" He said, "That's where the water level got to in the flood, I don't know, 2020 or 2019, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly what year it was." And, he had asked, I guess, the building owner, maintenance person, like, how come they don't clean that off? And they said they wanted it as a remembrance of how high the water got. And that, to me, is a clear, literal mark on a building that shows the level of chaos. And he was talking about the billions of dollars of damages that the flood caused. You can think about all of the buildings that were between the river and that place in that moment, and how high the water had to come to get to that line. And my mind started reeling, and I'm thinking, when you're in that moment, when the flood waters are rising, they hit the feet, they hit the ankles, they hit the knee, you got to get out. There's nothing you can do. The water is rising, the water is coming, the chaos is coming at you. I think what you're talking about, though, is, how do we ground ourselves in such a way that despite that water level and despite the chaos, like, we can make some purposeful choices to position ourselves well. But then I think to also remember this is not going to last forever, even though it seems all-consuming and threatening, even to the point of, possible life and death situations in some cases. But it's not going to last forever.
No, and I think that's there's a great Venn diagram that I've seen that says it's A, B, and C. A, things that are going to, A, things that we like, B, things that we don't like, C, the intersection of all of that is things that will change. In other words, things that you like aren't going to last forever, and things that you don't like are not going to last forever. The one thing that's constant in life is change.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a good point. It's not going to last forever. Are there things that we can influence to make it end sooner or to prolong? Probably. But back to how do we prepare ourselves for those things, I think that's a really good thought to have. This is not going to be forever. This isn't going to be my forever state, and things will change. What can I do to change them for the better?
Yeah. And I liked that idea of having a visual marker, because I think we have all been through stuff in our lives where we need that remembrance, because in the heat of it, you don't know how long the flood's going to last. You don't know what level of damage it's going to do. You don't know if you're going to survive. You don't know if your house is going to stay intact, all of these things. But when it's over and there's that visual reminder, the next time there's chaos, hopefully we can train our brains such that we can look back at that mark and say, oh yeah, I've been in this place of chaos before. I did come through it. Now, let me de-escalate a little bit and begin to look at this through a different lens.
I think it's really important that we stop and, what you're describing is an altar. Mm-hmm. In the Old Testament stories, they often, they were told, hey, stop and make an altar here so that generations in the future will remember what happened here. Mm-hmm. I think we often are not paying attention to things that from our past, from history. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And I think that leaving marks in our lives, even if they're painful, can be reminders of where we've come, what we've overcome, and to mentally prepare or physically prepare for what's coming next.
Yeah. So let's say we've got those markers, we look back and we see them and say, okay, I remember I've been in a similar place before, or I remember this feeling of overwhelming, I'm incapacitated. I remember this from before. I don't want to fall into that same mindset. I want to approach this differently. How does looking back help us to move forward?
Well, I think we can look back and remember the things that we've done and not done well. I'm not very good at this, but on many days, at the end of the day, I'll reflect back and say, what went well, what didn't go well, do I know why? Yeah. There's lots of things that happen to us, lots of situations we find ourselves in that uncover our blind spots, uncover things that trigger us towards emotional reaction, things that even we surprise ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good to reflect at the end of the day and say, okay, that could have gone better. What could I have done to make that better? And I think that so there are many people who make a daily habit of that and really promote that and say, wow, it's made a big difference in my life. So I think with even little things and practicing on little things, it's a good way to be able to think about the big things. Now, sometimes it's too soon, it's too dramatic, I can't think of it right now.
Sure. No
problem. But at some point, it would usually, I think for me, it behooves me to think back and think, okay, what could I have done differently? Am I happy with the way all that went, my reactions to, my responses to? What can I do in the future that might make that better for me and the people around me?
Yeah. I know we've talked about how anxiety really impacts our ability to make good, rash decisions. It impacts our ability to maintain peace and all of these, critical components of how it disrupts the moment. And so I think being very mindful of anxiety level is going to be another key component to this. When your body starts dumping all kinds of hormones and you begin to think irrationally, begin to go into this place of fear, this place of panic, you're not your best self, you're not your best decision maker, or you're not the best decision maker, and you certainly aren't processing real time in a way that's going to benefit you because you're in fight or flight mode.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, that looking back and saying, okay, I've encountered this emotion before. I could have done it better then. Let me stop. And this is so much of what we talk about. I feel like almost on a weekly basis, stopping what we're thinking in the moment, or choosing to put a pause on, because you're getting to that place. A decision has to be made. I'm either gonna go all in on this, chaotic mindset and go wherever it leads me, or I'm gonna stop and really be purposeful. I'm gonna think back. I'm gonna remember bad choices that I made in the past. I'm gonna remember good choices I've made in the past, and figure out how is that going to serve me in this moment.
And it's ironic that when you bring up anxiousness, this can cause anxiousness. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to do this again, and I can't get out of this pattern. That's not the point. The point is, and it's not going to be the first time.
Sure.
Oh, I've thought about this situation. If it ever happens again, I'll be perfect.
No.
That's not the point. The point is, first, to become aware. Second, to think, okay, maybe I could do this differently. Third is to try it a little bit, especially if you've got an opportunity to try it on little things versus the big things. I'm always late. Okay, they're fighting in our legislature right now in New Mexico about whether to stay on daylight savings time or get off. Well, there's, let's just say there's Gary time, which is always 10 minutes late, right? I want everybody to go to that. Well, okay, if you're gonna work on that, right, and if you think that's a problem, well, then maybe you ought to, come back and say, okay, what can I do to work on the little things? What can I be on time once today, right? So it's not one of those things where you have to be anxious about being anxious. You don't have to be anxious about being perfect. Go for the little wins. Go for the, hey, you know what? I did it once today. That's progress.
Yeah. So you're talking about evaluating kind of a lifestyle that maybe skews chaotic. So the chaotic nature of being late and what that does in anxiety over each new appointment, each new meeting. You're talking about taking off just a bite-sized chunk of, all right, I'm going to be intentional to kind of reschedule myself and see it as a win if I'm on time for one of my 10 out of the day.
Sure. Or if I know there's going to be a particularly contentious meeting, what if I decided I could get there 5 minutes early, sit in the room by myself and take a couple of deep breaths and imagine everybody's smiling and shaking hands at the end of the meeting? I think whatever works for you is the point. Is, what can I do proactively to reduce chaos in any given situation? Part of that is reducing my own internal chaos and my own anxiousness and what chaos I'm bringing to the situation.
Certainly. You're talking about imagining people smiling and shaking hands at the end, and somebody might say, oh, that's kind of silly, but I think it's really important to have that type of visioning, because we are so good at telling ourselves stories, and if you start telling yourself a negative story like, oh, so-and-so's not going to listen, I'm sure this is going to be the response, blah, 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 and you start spinning up this story in your head, your anxiety goes up and your outcome's almost predetermined based on the story that you've already said. So that exercise of imagining, smiles all around and handshakes at the end goes a long way in doing that reset in your temperature.
If you're calling that silly, that's funny, because that's the way I've lived my life since my early days at Intel, when we used to have this thing called constructive confrontation, which was really just kill them with data, make them cry, right? And so as engineers, we got good at it, and there was some very contentious meetings I knew I was walking into, and that's what I started doing early on, and it worked really well for me. I can only tell you what works for me, but I tell you what, having that vision of everybody standing up, smiling, and shaking hands at the end, and saying, "Wow, it's great working with you," that was a huge difference in my life.
Yeah.
And it was my desired outcome that made me act differently.
That's good. Well, so we've touched on, the internal, the personal thing that we can do. There's situations and there's others. So let's talk about the situation for a moment. Whether it be a literal floodwater rising, it be, some other level of chaos within your company, or some sort of argument that's happened to cause chaos in the family. much of the time there's little to nothing we can do about the situation itself. But do you have something different you want to add?
It's always our response to it, right? It's never the thing. And you know, when I used to run a home care company, you know, a caregiver calling off shortly before a shift was supposed to start was a very common occurrence. But what I was interested in is what the reactions of the people in the office were when that happened and when it was communicated, because it's, oh my God, here's this thing again. Well, my goodness, something that's going to happen frequently and inevitably. My goodness, that would be a time to start thinking about, well, what reaction could I have that's better than rolling my eyes, hoping I can fire everyone, and you know, and chucking it and going home. That probably is not the best set of responses, but it all starts with that complaining, that rolling the eyes. And by the way, that stuff is contagious.
Oh yeah.
You know, I love the Navy SEAL guy who talked to us one time and said that, you know, during the last 24 hours they do this impossible drill, and when everybody's running around, the master sergeant says, "On me," and everybody comes and gathers, and he says, "Okay, let me tell you something. Panic is contagious, and you know what else? Stupid is contagious." And I would say that everybody take a couple of breaths, reevaluate, and assess your situation and move on. And he said that's always the turning point of every class, is because we get ourselves so worked up about stuff. When there's always a better response. And so I think that that's just something to think about as we move forward. That initial response, which you can work on, I can work on, is sometimes key.
Yeah.
You know, think about starting with a complaint versus starting with a solution. Think about starting with a complaint and a roll of the eyes and a feeling of, oh my God, this is happening again, versus, okay, another opportunity. What can I do to work on the systems? What's my backup plans? What am I doing about this, and this? What can I do to make this into even a net positive here? Who else can I bless with a shift that they weren't expecting today and some work that they need? I mean, there's all kinds of different approaches than rolling your eyes, complaining, and making everybody else around you miserable.
Certainly. Well, so your example maybe hits two birds with one stone, right? Both the circumstance and others.
True.
And so as we are dealing with others that may be involved in our chaos, I think you've brought up something that's reminiscent of a podcast episode in our earlier days, talking about, can we be curious in the moment and not heap a bunch of judgment onto the situation, either, you know, just mentally or as we're interacting with somebody else. But, you know, in your case of somebody's called in sick, they're not showing up for their shift, we can make the judgment like, oh, they're, you know, just making an excuse, they're being lazy, they're whatever it is, you know, or we can stop and we can intentionally be curious, like, I wonder what's going on with them, you know, that they've called in sick today. They didn't seem sick yesterday, but maybe there's a circumstance that I'm unaware of. You know, maybe they've got an ill child, maybe something has happened. Let me choose to be curious in this moment so that I don't heap judgment on this person and continue to add to the chaos of the moment.
Not only with respect to the antagonist, is what we would call it in that point if you're writing a book, but also with the other people around, right?
Sure.
And you know, what's our value here? Do we want to support people who are in trouble? I mean, this person, I'm sure, would rather work the shift than not. They've found themselves in a life situation that's not going to allow them to. They had to pick up the phone and call, and that's not comfortable for them. They know the chaos it's going to cause here, and so let's give them some grace and move on.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. And by the way, I think a great example of this, and I'm thinking of other examples, but would be, okay, what's our value here? We put the caregivers at the highest level of all the things that we do from a priority standpoint, right? Get and keep good caregivers was our number one value in that company. And so get and keep means get and keep good caregivers, right? How do we keep them? How do we support them? How do we make sure that they're doing okay? You know, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, everything else we can do. What can we do to support them so that they don't have to call off as much as happens, right? And so I think you can turn that around pretty quickly. What are our values?
Yeah.
Okay, our number one value here, get and keep great caregivers. Okay, well then if that's our value, how should we respond to this situation? I think so one of the things that we can do with respect to other people in a given situation is to say, what are our values here?
Yeah.
What do we do as a tribe?
Yeah.
What are the things that we value most? What are we trying to accomplish here?
Yeah.
Do we mean what we say?
That is a really powerful question, and I'm imagining some different scenarios where that could play out. You've got a sudden and unexpected death that's hit your family, and maybe it's a really shocking, somebody's at fault, there's a car accident, there's a DUI, whatever, like something has happened. You're deep in the throes of grief, you're deep in the throes of chaos, but to say, what are our values as a tribe is a powerful reset so that it leads the next hours and days in a different way. Because if the intentionality is, okay, we're going to walk out our values in the midst of this storm, what a different perspective than just being tossed in the moment and reacting emotionally, in a very vulnerable, raw way where inevitably there's going to be mistakes made, there's going to be additional pain caused because, we've all heard that expression, hurt people, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're reacting in the moment, but if you can just in a split second say, what are our values? We're going to walk those out in the midst of this pain. What a different outcome you might experience.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to come back to those values that you've established as a tribe, whether that's a work group at work or whether that's a family. Last night at dinner, we were talking to a colleague whose, child hit somebody at school, right? And the mom wanted to say, don't ever hit people, and the father was like, well, but you can't tell them not to hit back, right? And instead of all that, it's like, hey, what I used to tell the kids all the time, as Opidals, we don't start fights. And it takes the rest of that away, okay? We can be angry, we can talk to other people, but we don't start fights. And that takes away the argument about whether you hit somebody back or not. It's just like, let's just try to sow more peace than fighting in the world, right? And we do that as our tribe, as the Opidals, that's what we do. And just instilling that early on with kids, I think, is a great way to do that. And it works in the workplace too.
Sure.
Okay, look, our value is this, right? Get and keep great caregivers. We just came up with that example off the fly, but that was our number one value out of 5. And so let's come back to that. And I think sometimes that can really help bring order out of chaos, is reminding people, what are we here for? What do we value? And what do we want to do as a result?
Yeah. So a couple of great takeaways. What do you do when chaos hits? So we've talked about kind of remembering where the water line was, remember those altars, so to speak. Looking back, how did you navigate past chaos, past times of chaos? Remembering it doesn't last forever, and reminding yourself the things that you did well, the things you didn't do so well, and trying to implement, the corrected version into the present chaos. But then also asking that question, what are our values, helping you navigate going forward? And remembering, there's very little you can do about the circumstance, there's very little that you can do about the other people involved, but there's a whole lot you can do with you, choosing to be curious, choosing not to jump into judgment, and doing that mental exercise of stop. I've got to remember, I've got to be intentional, and I've got to move forward with a different outlook, because last time didn't pan out so well.
Good summary.
All right. Well, I guess we'll call it quits for today, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. As always, appreciate if you take just a moment to leave a rating on whatever channel that you watch or listen to this podcast on. And of course, you're always welcome to leave a comment, whether on that channel or on our main webpage, which is curiositynotjudgment.com. And have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.